Hello, I'm Gerald Finken, and I'm CEO of RxE2. And I've been bringing you a series of webinars about E2 dispensing, this new, disruptive, innovative way that we're going to do clinical supplies going into the future. And of course, RxE2 is the company that's bringing the practice of pharmacy to clinical drug trials, a great way that we're going to improve time, cost, quality of clinical trials. So the webinar series we've been talking about a lot of things, and today I promised you I'd talk to you about comparators and how this E2 dispensing model is going to change the way we look at how we source, order, dispense, use comparators. But I want to point out too that when we talk about comparators, the same thing could be said really about the concomitant meds that you need, ancillary supplies, diagnostics, devices. These all sometimes fall outside of when we talk about comparators and how do we obtain them and how we use them. But really, when I talk about everything in this presentation, you could be thinking about, well, maybe I have diagnostics I want to supply or other types of devices or et cetera that might be needed in your clinical trial that's going to be just made so simple. So let's move into this, okay? So remember, like we're talking about E2 dispensing, remember these things that this E2 dispensing changes every aspect of the clinical supply chain. You know, we've talked about labeling, we've talked about project management, the idea of patient-centricity. All these things change in the way we think about and supply clinical supplies to the patients. It definitely simplifies across the entire supply chain, and by simplifying, it doesn't take weeks to create, packaging labeling requirements. It's just a pharmacy manual that's pretty much boilerplate with a few changes that within a couple hours you can have your supply chain taken care of. Pretty interesting stuff. And of course, what I want to talk about is focus on one patient at a time. That's critical. This E2 dispensing. Focus on one patient at a time instead of thinking about how we're going to supply all the sites and how we're going to supply depots. It gets us down into the unit dose, which is wonderful, as I call it, unit dose, which is really patient-centric. It's critical to remember that. So let's take a look at this, comparisons. You like that? Comparisons of comparator process. So the one thing is, of course, in the old traditional model, the one I was used to when I was at CSM, you're ordering of the bulk, ordering a lot of supplies so you have them on hand, the package and label, along with your product, versus this is just one prescription at a time. E2 dispensing is one-offs, right? The other thing is that, they started producing prescription cards so that patients could go to their pharmacy and get some of the comparators or concomitant meds as an ease of use for the patients. But if you think about it, the same thing's going to occur in this, that the patient gets a prescription and they go to their pharmacy, which is the central fill or their mail order pharmacy. And we can get into that at another time about the difference between central fill and mail order. Both, though, is how we can operate. Central fill really means that we can give to the local pharmacy for them to dispense, obtain or dispense, and mail orders where we go right from what I call our central pharmacy directly to the patients. Both of these are patient-centric. And then we also want to talk about blinding, right, which is one of the key things. And this is where we really need to talk. You should call me and get into the details of this, how we're going to really rethink the way we blind comparators. So instead of thinking about all the bulk and blinding, we could talk about just the blinding of the one-off, right? The patient is going to get the medication, not the sites. The patient's going to get the medication. And there's all kinds of little things we could do differently that's going to make it much more easier to what I think about how we blind and think about blinding to patients versus the blinding to the clinical site. And we talked about that. And when we talked about site-facing versus patient-facing. And since this is patient-facing, we can blind it a little bit differently. So how does it work? Now remember, comparators, concomitant meds, ancillary supplies, devices, diagnostics. It goes very simply. The doctor writes a prescription. Sounds pretty familiar. Doctor sends a prescription to the pharmacy, and most of the prescriptions today are electronic, so that's not uncommon, right? The pharmacy dispenses that medication, the prescription, right? And of course, mails to the patient in our direct-to-patient model, or to the pharmacy to dispense in the central fill model. And of course, then the pharmacist counsels the patient. State law requires that anytime you dispense medication to a patient, and investigational drugs are a drug, so patients need to be counseled by a pharmacist. Does this look familiar? Well, if any of us ever had antibiotics or any prescriptions filled for, our cholesterol or hypertension, for other disorders, et cetera, we know how this works. And it's just the same as we've always had and we're used to. So now I'm in a clinical trial and I just follow the same procedure that I've done all along whenever I get a prescription. And I also want to talk about the blinding occurs at the time of dispensing, which is, again, very critical and simplified. The advantages of this, besides, the simplification of the entire supply chain and the way we think about it, the way we think about ordering and usage is really just wonderful. The other thing is no waste. It's one-off. You don't order the medication, get it until you get a prescription. So the pharmacy has the medication, not the patient, not the clinical site, not the GMP location. Pharmacy has it. They're dispensing it just like every other dispensing medication when another doctor writes for the same concomitant med or for the specialty drug or REMS, etc. Anyhow, no waste. There's no expiry dates on this stuff. So when you think about it, we're going to dispense medication, usually it's going to be used in a month. So this whole idea about making sure you get the bulk supplies with the longest use date just goes away. Every prescription can have a different expiry date. It's okay. It's tracked. It's fine. 30 days, done. It's used or returned. Very, very simple. The unique sourcing opportunities, I can't begin to tell you about how this can work with specialty and REMS. And if you start thinking about how you can get those comparators or how you can't get those, all the pens, because the top 5 specialty drugs are all pens, unique dosing, there's some really interesting sourcing that we can start doing with our central fill mail order pharmacy, who has relationships with other specialty pharmacies that can dispense to take care of some of these comparators that you haven't been able to quite figure out how to take care of them. And of course, the biggest thing, as we talked about, it's all under subscription-based pricing, right? And this, you can, again, contact me. We can go over. It's none of this craziness of buying all that bulk and spending millions of dollars up front instead of just pay as you go, which is just a fabulous way to do that. And so that's it. It's just that simple. And so what I'd like to do is for this shorter version, because it's a key topic, but I didn't go into much of the details that we need to. So what I'd like to say is, be the first person to comment on this presentation through LinkedIn, and I'll send you a really nice bike bag with RxE2 on it so you can remember that we can source comparators really easily. So comment on LinkedIn and I'll send you this. Isn't that great? What a deal. Thanks very much. And the last webinar we're going to do, if you tune in, please tune in. I'm going to be talking about the future of clinical trials and clinical supplies and how what's happening with drug development is changing so drastically and so quickly that we have to go to this E2 dispensing model because the models that we've used in the past just won't work. Think about the N of 1 and how do you do clinical supplies in N of 1 unless you do E2 dispensing, which is an N of 1. Again, we'll discuss that next time. Thank you very much. Please join me next time. Take care.